Nonetheless, from a theological point of view, it's perfectly possible to hold that the Bible doesn't really take a stand on the matter. Passages that seem to indicate a young earth may be understood as a way of accommodating the message of the Bible to a pre-modern audience, for example. And importantly, most of the theology and biblical interpretation needed for that was worked out well before Darwin came along. The educated public basically understood that the earth was not 6,000 years ago before Darwin published The Origin of Species. Okay. So evolution, in the sense of common descent, poses these theological problems, and so too does the idea that natural selection drives evolution by producing adaptations in species to fit their environment. So too does natural selection pose theological problems. The first problem is that natural selection seems to undermine one of the traditional mainstays of natural theology. Now, natural theology is the project of trying to obtain knowledge of God and of his attributes from examining his creation. There's arguably biblical warrant for this, but it doesn't really take off as an intellectual enterprise until the rise of modern science, which seemed to offer new resources for establishing religious views. And the argument from design itself takes off in the 17th century and gets its classic exposition in a book called, ready for it, Natural Theology, published 1802 by the late 18th century, early 19th century Anglican clergyman William Paley. There it is, its hat. Now, Paley argued that just as a watch's arrangement of parts organized to perform a specific function, telling what time it is, just as a watch bespeaks the existence of a designer, a watchmaker, so too does an eye's arrangement of parts bespeak the existence of an eye maker, who wants for the possessors of eyes to be able to navigate around the world using visual information. Now, what Darwin did, quite consciously, as he studied Paley at Cambridge, and found the argument so impressive that he later told a correspondent that he had Paley's book almost by heart, what Darwin did was undermine this argument by showing that the arrangements of means to ends to accomplish purposes in the natural world that had so impressed Paley had a natural explanation, that of natural selection. This is why the biologist Richard Dawkins, who avows himself as impressed with adaptation as was Paley, entitled his book about the power of natural selection, The Blind Watchmaker. So natural selection seems to make God's creative activity, at least as regards life, unnecessary. And for many people, such as Dawkins, this seems to render the inference that God doesn't exist more plausible. Now, there are other cases in which a theological explanation, like design, has been supplanted by a natural explanation, and there hasn't been so much religious resistance. There are, for example, references in the Bible to gods causing various meteorological phenomena. But meteorology managed to get established as a science, and even, in an ultimate accolade, even get its own cable channel, without major outcry. And the devout can, perhaps with some effort, regard storms and the like as natural phenomena through which God works his will in the world. But the way in which natural selection works seems like a particularly inappropriate way to conceive God as going about accomplishing his purposes. Inappropriate in two ways, perhaps. First, isn't natural selection, with all the blood and gore and death over the geological eons, a horrible way for nature to operate? Red in tooth and claw. Although that's a line that comes from Tennyson's In Memoriam, which was published 9 years before The Origin. Darwin himself noted this. What a book a devil's chaplain might write on the clumsy, wasteful, blundering, low, and horribly cruel works of nature. And so, if your God is working through natural selection, you might worry that you've got a sadistic God, as this cartoon illustrates. Notice the bears are off the left. Or at least a disinterested God. Second, and similarly, although Darwin wasn't always consistent on this point, and his successors were even less consistent, natural selection doesn't seem to have any intrinsic goal. It merely adapts organisms for their immediate surroundings, but has no preferred direction, which is not what one might expect. For centuries, people thought that the universe was hierarchically ordered in a great chain of being, with God at the top, rocks at the bottom, and everybody else in between, stratified accordingly. All things superb and beautiful. After Darwin, the great chain of being is essentially replaced with a branching tree of life, in which God's providence is hard to detect. And this is heightened, of course, by the discovery, before Darwin, of mass extinctions in the history of life. For example, at the end of the Cretaceous, 65 million years ago, at the end of the Permian, 250 million years ago. If God designed life, why did he let it all but die out time and time again? Practically 75% of Earth's life died out in the Permian extinction. That seems risky. And so that's the second theological problem that natural selection might be thought to pose. Now, it's fairly familiar how these problems played out in the West after Darwin. There were initial conflicts, famously represented by the Huxley-Wilberforce debate. Seeking to score a point against Darwin's disciples, Samuel Wilberforce, the Bishop of Oxford, in a meeting in Oxford in 1860, unwisely baited Huxley by inquiring whether he would prefer to think of himself as descended from an ape on his grandfather's side or on his grandmother's side. According to legend, at any rate, he quickly had his comeuppance. Huxley whispered to a neighbor, "The Lord hath delivered him into mine hands," and then retorted loudly that he was not ashamed of his simian ancestry, but that he would be ashamed to be connected with a man who used great gifts to obscure the truth. It wasn't all that confrontational. Take, for example, the case of the United States. Two of the most eminent scientists in Darwin's day in the United States were Asa Gray at Harvard and Louis Agassiz, also at Harvard, who divided about whether Darwin was right. Agassiz was probably the last scientific holdout against evolution of any great eminence. They divided about whether Darwin was right, while both accepting more or less traditional forms of Christianity. Eventually, and we're still in the tail end of the 19th century here, and eventually, most mainstream denominations made their peace of the sort with evolution, while a few sects, including particularly Seventh-day Adventists, and a large rump faction, fundamentalists, resolved to oppose evolution fiercely, of which more in a moment. So it looked, though, around the turn of the century, when it came to evolution, religion was generally on the verge of reconciliation with science. So what happened? Three main factors seem important in the onset of anti-evolutionism as a mass social movement in the United States. And these are the association of evolution with German militarism, which led to the horrors of World War I trench warfare. And that's the trench at Verdun. Second, the widening of American public education. For the first time after World War I, students, particularly in rural areas, were being exposed to more than just reading, writing, and arithmetic, with books like Hunter's Civic Biology, which had the concept of evolution in them. That's a page from the 1914 edition. And third, the revival of evangelical Christianity in the form of fundamentalism as introduced in the book The Fundamentals. That's a modern edition there. I couldn't find a good photogenic